Hosea chapter 9 and 10. Hear the word of the Lord. Rejoice not, O Israel, exult not like the peoples, for you have played the whore, forsaking your God. You have loved a prostitute's wages on all the threshing floors. Threshing floor and wine vat shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail them. They shall not remain in the land of the Lord, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean food in Assyria. They shall not pour drink offerings of the wine to the Lord, and their sacrifices shall not please him. It shall be like mourner's bread to them. All who eat of it shall be defiled, for their bread shall be for their hunger only. It shall not come to the house of the Lord. What would you do on the day of the appointed festival and on the day of the feast of the Lord? For behold, they are going away from destruction, but Egypt shall gather them. Memphis shall bury them. Nettles shall possess their precious things of silver. Thorns shall be in their tents. The days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it. The prophet is a fool. The man of the spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and great hatred. The prophet is the watchman of Ephraim with my God. Yet fowler's snare is on all his ways, and hatred in the house of his God. They have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. Like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel, like the first fruit on the fig tree in its first season. I saw your fathers, but they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame and became detestable, like the thing they loved. Ephraim's glory shall fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Even if they bring up children, I will bereave them till none is left. Woe to them when I depart from them. Ephraim, as I have seen, was like a young palm planted in a meadow. But Ephraim must not lead his children out to slaughter. Give them, O Lord. What will you give them? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breast. Every evil of theirs is in Gilgal. There I began to hate them because of the wickedness of their deeds. I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. All their princes are rebels. Ephraim is stricken. Their root is dried up. They shall bear no fruit. Even though they give birth, I will put their beloved children to death. My God will reject them because they have not listened to him. They shall be wanderers through the nations. Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more its fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. For now they will say, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. And a king? What could he do for us? They utter mere words. With empty oaths they make covenants. So judgment springs up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. The inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Bethaven. Its people mourn for it, and so do its idolatrous priests. Those who rejoiced over it and over its glory, for it has departed from them. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria as tribute to the great king. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his idol. Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. The high places of Aven, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. From the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel. There they have continued. Shall not the war against the unjust overtake them in Gibeah? When I please, I will discipline them, and nations shall be gathered against them when they are bound up for their double iniquity. Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh, and I spared her fair neck. But I would put Ephraim to the yoke. Judah must plow. Jacob must harrow for himself. Sow for yourselves righteousness and reap steadfast love. Break up your fallow ground, for it is the time to seek the Lord, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. You have plowed iniquity. You have reaped injustice. You have eaten the fruit of lies, because you have trusted in your own way and in the multitude of your warriors. Therefore the tumult of war shall arise among your people, and all your fortresses shall be destroyed. As Shalman destroyed Beth Arbel on the day of battle, mothers were dashed to pieces with their children. Thus it shall be done to you, O Bethel. because of your great evil. At dawn, the King of Israel shall be utterly cut off. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, the times, they are a-changing. But are they getting better or worse? You know, there's the assumption in our culture is things always improve, that anything today is better than anything yesterday. It's what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. In other words, we just think we always assume we're better, that there's this assumption of evolution. But is it true? Are things really getting better or worse? Well, that depends on how you judge them. By what standard are things getting better or worse, declining or improving, regressing or progressing? There are some objective standards we can use, like lifespan. After consistently going up ever since we can measure it, basically, for a little over a century, average lifespan, which began about a century ago, was about 51 to 55 years old, dipped to 39 in 1918 during the Spanish influenza. After going up consistently since then, and reached an average of almost 79 years, 78.9 years in 2014. It has slowly declined since then over the last 6 years to now at 78.6 years. We can also objectively measure wealth. The Federal Reserve does a survey every 3 years of the nation's wealth and found in the last survey in 2017 that the median net worth for American families has dropped 8% from 1998 over almost 20 years. Meanwhile, median debt rose by 25%. So Americans own less and owe more. And what wealth we do have is increasingly unequally distributed. Since 1973, that's been the case over different presidents. Since 1973, the rich have been getting richer and the poor poorer. And of course, those are all signs of decline. What about things that are less easily measured? When my professor at a University of Chicago class I took had us read his pre-published book in which he argued that there would be what he would call a fourth great awakening, spearheaded again by Christians, which was an interesting point of view since he himself was not a Christian. He called himself a secular Jew, but he said Christians would spearhead a fourth great awakening to bring more progress. And I wrote a paper in response to him arguing that he was wrong. Now, of course, you're always in thin ice if you argue that your professor is wrong. But I argued that evangelical Christians had declined since the Great Awakening and the Puritan days. And he invited me to his office to talk about it, and he plied me with various questions. But I didn't change his mind any, because he published the book pretty much unchanged. And the next year, he hired me to be his teaching assistant. 20 years later, though, I stand by my conclusion that we're declining. How do we know, though, that we're spiritually declining? What do we measure it with? Well, one of the main academic issues about Puritanism is how did it decline? Now, some even question whether it actually ever did decline, but I think that Puritan declension, that's what they call it, declension, I think it's a fact demonstrated by the fact that Puritans are not now reigning over a pious New England. Okay, if you haven't noticed that, New England is not exactly a Bible Belt now with all kinds of Puritans in control there. The Puritans themselves overwhelmingly testified that there was a spiritual decline in their own day. Eleazar Mather noted that, quote, there is a sad declining in the spirit of the churches, and called his own time in 1676 a backsliding time. A synod or meeting of the New England churches met in Boston in 1679 stated that it was beyond doubt that the churches had declined and that the problems that had afflicted them lately, especially King Philip's War, were God's judgment for their decline. The title to a 1683 sermon speaks volumes, a plea for the life of a dying religion. Increase Mather prefaced the published version of that sermon with, quote, that our founding interest in religion has been for many years languishing and dying is the observation of all men that have their hearts exercised in discerning things of this nature. Cotton Mather, Increase Mather's son, wrote, quote, I saw a fearful degeneracy. A minister's dying plea was to, quote, look after the dying power of godliness in the churches. He said the old spirit was dying out with the old saints. Quote, certainly the power of godliness is now grievously decayed among us. A Puritan named Michael Wigglesworth published a popular poem at this time in 1662 entitled God's Controversy with New England, which in part read, quote, "If these be they, how is it that I find, instead of holiness, carnality, instead of heavenly frames and earthly mind, for burning zeal, lukewarm indifferency, for flaming love, key cold dead-heartedness, for temperance and meat and drink and clothes, excess." Puritan William Bradford in 1694 wrote, quote, "Love and fervent zeal do seem to sleep. Security in the world on men do creep." So they believed there was a decline. But that's all their conclusions. How do you measure it? What is spiritual decline? Well, we see that here in this passage in Hosea chapter 9 and 10 in 4 parts. First, a decline in religion. Second, a decline in the heart. Third, a decline of leaders. And finally, a decline of fruit. First, there's a decline of religion, starting in chapter 9. But decline in religion does not mean that they were not religious, as though there's fewer people attending their religious festivals and assemblies. They were very religious. They had altars and shrines, it says, on every threshing floor. That's threshing floors is where they brought their grain to get the kernel, to grind it to flour. Probably every large field had one, certainly at least maybe every town. That way they could give thanks to God. They thresh the grain, they get it into flour, and they could then, right then and there, because there's some kind of shrine or altar, they could right then and there give thanks to God, or maybe Baal, or maybe both, for the bountiful harvest. It's not really clear which from the passage, who they're giving thanks to, and they probably didn't really care which themselves. Here he says, your religion is so declined. Don't hold any more festivals. No more celebrations. Don't rejoice. In verse 1, don't exult. Don't be happy in your worship, because this is the reason for their decline. You have played the whore. Hosea knew all about that, didn't he? He was an expert on that. Like a prostitute going out looking for a customer, so is declined religion. Going out looking for more numbers, more popularity, get more money, more people in the seats, willing to do anything to give the customer what he wants, to get him to come and to be part. They have, in verse 1, forsaken your God. Like earlier, Gomer had forsaken Hosea, preferring other lovers. But don't think that means that Israel didn't worship the Lord anymore. They say, God here says, you've forsaken me, but they would probably think, what do you mean? We have altars in every threshing floor. How have we forsaken you? We see in verse 4 that they do, in fact, are worshiping, sort of, the Lord. In verse 5, their feast says, of the Lord. They pour out drink offerings. They give other offerings to the Lord. So, they would ask back, how have we forsaken you, Lord? Talk about, we got altars everywhere. Well, they've forsaken him like an adulterous person, thinking that he or she can keep the marriage relationship and have other lovers at the same time. They thought, we can add a little Baal worship on the side, can't we? I mean, what's the harm? Maybe make a calf image to worship the Lord with. Why not? It works for Baal, it works for us. Maybe just mix it all together. Throw in anything that seems enjoyable. It seems to be religious. They just assume that as long as the Lord got as long as he got his worship, well, he wouldn't mind if we throw a little extra to some other gods. Like some people today think the Lord won't mind if we use part of our life. It is part of our life to serve money. He won't mind, will he? I mean, I'm still giving him 51%. Or maybe he won't mind if we turn a worship service or 2 or 3 or 4 a year to exalt maybe the nation or the flag or mothers or our favorite politician. But he does mind. He minds so much, he is so angry that he scorns their worship as prostitution. And he vows that these threshing floors, these altars they had there, and the wine vats that they've been using their religion to fill them, thinking they'll get prosperity if they mix their religion with their harvest, that they will not feed them anymore. They won't be fruitful anymore. They'll even be driven out of the land. They'll have to flee back to Egypt It will be the Exodus in reverse in verse 3. They are going to destruction. They're going back to Egypt, where they will be absorbed. They're going to be buried there. They're not just going back there to escape a little bit and then be able to come back. No, they're going to die there in that nation, and their altars and their images back in Israel will be overgrown. God is sending, instead of feast days to celebrate the Lord, he calls them in verse 7, days of punishment, days of recompense. In other words, days that I'm going to pay you back, Israel, for that corrupt religion. They scoffed at prophets like Amos, told them to go back home to Judah, or Hosea here, scoffed at them. It's foolish. They're madmen. They're talking about judgment and destruction. What are you talking about? Hosea. The happy days are here again. They've been rolling. Prosperity has been going on for a whole generation now under Jeroboam II. God is going to, and Hosea says back to them, the God is going to pay them back for the way they've rejected his word and his prophets. Israel here is probably about the year 750 BC when this is given. And he's saying, you're like Israel, you're like you were about 400 years earlier during the days of Gibeah, during the Judges. There's been no progress. You've regressed to that. When that town of Gibeah was so immoral, when the men there, when they couldn't rape a man who happened to be traveling through, they raped to death a woman who was put out there for them. Gibeah was Israel's own Sodom and Gomorrah, except Israel was supposed to be better. They had more light. They were supposed to have a pure religion, but Gibeah was wiped out for that, utterly destroyed. And now God says that they're going back to that they've regressed. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sin. Are you declining? Well, you're here, so you have the religion, but be careful that it's not the corrupt, self-serving religion, all about keeping the money pouring in, keeping the kids out of trouble, keeping the good life going and the good times rolling. It's using God like he's an insurance company, that if you pay the premiums, he'll make sure to maintain your lifestyle. Are you declining? Or are you seeking to purify your worship? Well, next there's a decline in the heart. What they used to think was glorious, what weighed on them in their heart is something of value, of importance. Literally was heavy, meaningful. Now they think, oh, that's light. That's cheap. It doesn't fill their hearts anymore. There's been a change, a before and after. But unlike in those weight loss pictures, they always show progress, right? Progress. The weight loss pictures. Before, they were a little obese, and now they're fit and trim. This change he's talking about here has been for the worse. In verse 10, before, Israel was a treasure, a wonderful find. Quote, like succulent grapes in the wilderness. Like stumbling. Imagine you're out in an arid desert, and there you come upon just juicy, plump grapes. You think, wow, what a treasure, what a find. And he's saying Israel was like that in the beginning. But they've not progressed. They've regressed. Before, the Lord had a zest and an enjoyment of his people, like the first fruit of a fig tree. I don't know much about fig trees. Apparently, people that like them. Like the first fruit. It's good fruit. You see it sprouting in season. Something to enjoy. God says before the decline, he saw Israel like that. He saw their fathers like that. But then they worship Baal Peor, calls it a thing of shame, and they became like what they worshiped. God calls it in verse 10, Baal Peor, a thing of shame. You become like what you worship. If you worship a glorious Lord, you become glorious, weighty, substantial, faithful, loving, true. If you worship something shameful, something empty, meaningless, an idol, money, pleasure, your ego, politics, whatever it is, you become shameful, empty, nothing. Here, Ephraim's, that's the northern kingdom's, glory in verse 11, what they regard as heavy, what fills their heart is important. What now feels weighty, important to them, maybe today, like something, who wins the Super Bowl? Or how much money we can make? maybe for churches, how many attendees we can have at our services. All the things that we regard as heavy, as glorious, will, he says, fly away like a bird. It'll be, in verse 11, it'll be so light, the wind will carry it away. It's not heavy, it's not glorious. It's empty. The result is that they will have no growth, no children. They'll lose their children. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. And even if they do have children, in verse 12, they'll be taken away. The hardest, worst thing that you can do to someone is to take or kill their children. This past week was the 8th anniversary of the passing of Cheyenne Stump. I think she was 11 or 12 when she died. She used to faithfully attend our Gym Junior program. Oddly enough, she wouldn't want to play with the other children. She was different in that way. She always wanted to come and help Mary or the others preparing the food and the drinks. I have a picture of her. There's usually a table over there. We're set up. I was standing over there. The kids come through the door. They all go scrambling, of course, for the balls like they usually do. Cheyenne, as usual, coming straight for the table to help with the refreshments. And I took her picture, and when I raised the camera, she raised her fist like that because she knows I'm going to tease her again. You know, go play with the other kids. And she would rather help. Well, in the summer of 2012, she had a brain hemorrhage, and I believe she was life-flighted to Duke Hospital, where they did an emergency brain surgery on her. I remember being told that she was in the ICU there, and I resolved that as soon as she was out, that I would go see her in the hospital. I never got to make that trip. Her family put up a monument in their yard for her that I pass by nearly every day. And this past Tuesday, passed it on the way here this morning, by the way, but this past Tuesday, for the first time, I stopped in my car and got out and walked into the field there and looked at it up close for the first time, just to remember Cheyenne. Now, I'm not saying that there was some kind of judgment like here. I don't know that, but the death of a child is the most horrendous thing. Now, imagine that on a large scale. So God says in verse 12, woe to them when I depart from them. When he departs, there will be this massive massacre, including of the children. There'll be deaths of children right and left. They were before, he says, like a young palm tree, full and green and promising and a meadow, but they've declined. They are now, after their decline, leading their children to slaughter. The course they are now on will result in the mass murder of their children. And that's what happened. So Hosea the prophet, passing on God's word here, he hears this from the Lord, and he stops in verse 14, and he prays for them. He's thanking, because he's hearing from the Lord that their children are going to be massacred, and he hears this, and he thinks, the children, the horror of it. And so he prays, give them, O Lord. This is Hosea interceding, I believe, for Israel after hearing this sentence of death on the children. Give them, O Lord. And he can't think what to give them. The sentence has been passed. So what can be given to them to spare them this horror? Give them, he thinks, what will you give them? The best thing that he can think to give them, to spare them the devastation of murdered children, is to give them a miscarrying womb and dry breast. If they're going to see their children slaughtered, then, O Lord, don't give them children at all. How did things get so bad? How do you decline so far that the best prayer the prophet can think for these people, to spare his people this, the best thing that he could think to pray for them is give them miscarriages. Imagine how low they have declined when that is the best blessing that can be imagined for them. But what happened? Their hearts declined. In chapter 10, verse 2, their heart is false, or the word could be translated as divided. It's trying to serve two masters, the Lord and Baal, or mammon, or materialism, or ego, or pleasure, or whatever. And that's because deep down, the heart is no longer filled with the glory of the Lord, with that heaviness of God's importance, that it makes no room for any rivals. That was what they should have been before. Now they have plenty of room for all kinds of other gods. In chapter 9, verse 15, every evil of theirs, he says, is in Gilgal. That's where they first crossed into the promised land, crossed the Jordan River into the promised land. And they set up a monument there to mark the spot that now, finally, we're in. The new nation has begun. But the God here says, your decline started at the very beginning. There was something wrong with their hearts. They were divided, and so the Lord began to hate them there. They hated, notice before, remember, they hated the prophets, they hated the Lord's word, and so God says, I'm hating you back. And so as in chapter 1, they will get no mercy. Before, in chapter 10, verse 1, they were he calls them a luxuriant vine, lush and fruitful. Now, after the decline, in chapter 9, verse 16, they are stricken, they're dried up, they're shriveled with no fruit. So if they do give birth, God promises, I will put their beloved children to death. Hosea himself then comments in verse 17, reminding them of one of his own children's names. Remember what his own children? One of them named, not my people. That God will reject them because they have not listened to him. So they won't be his people anymore. Before they were God's people, in God's land, luxuriant, fruitful. Now, after the decline, they will be bereaved and wanderers through other nations. If our hearts are false, if we're double-minded, claiming to believe and to love the Lord, but then thinking and so living just like the world, just as materialistic, as individualistic, as rebellious, then we will decline. We will bear our guilt. And the Lord promises in verse 2, because he is jealous, like any spouse being cheated on is jealous, he promises to destroy whatever it is in our lives that is competing with him for our love. He will break down our pillars, our altars, destroy them. He will take our money that we tried to serve along with him. He'll estrange us from our children because we focused on the family and first instead of on him. He'll poison our relationships because we thought that they were more glorious, more weighty than he was. The decline starts in the heart, and what we weigh is the heaviest thing that sits on us. Third, there's a decline of leaders, starting in verse 3. After the long, peaceful, thriving reign of Jeroboam II, about 40 years, or maybe more, Israel went through about a half dozen kings in 20 years, most of them assassinated and replaced by the assassin, only himself to soon be assassinated. Kings were cheap, they thought. Now they will say in verse 3, we have no king. Oh, they technically always had a king. They didn't go through any period of, like being a republic, no Republic of Israel for any time. But they could easily ignore him, right? I mean, if he gave, the turnover in kings was such, one gives an order today, you can just ignore it because tomorrow he'll probably be gone. So they could say, we have no king. And they said they had no king because we do not fear the Lord. I doubt they really said that out loud, but that's deep down what they thought. We do not fear the Lord. In other words, we don't think he's going to judge us for anything. We don't think he's going to punish us for our sins. We think we can get away with living any way we want forever. There's never going to be a price to pay. We do not fear the Lord. They didn't think the Lord would punish them for their anarchy and their lawlessness because they didn't believe he punishes for anything. Or maybe they thought they paid him off. They paid him so well in all these shrines and altars they had all over every place. They thought he would never judge them. The Lord Jesus said that he will be sending away many religious people to hell, people so sure of their religion and their righteousness that they will be boasting right in front of him of all the things they've done for him. But he'll respond, depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. You people who think you have no king, who don't fear the Lord's judgment. Maybe you have a doctrine of so-called grace that excuses you from, so that you think you can live any way you want, say anything you want. Antinomianism. Many religious people today live lawlessly, thinking that grace is an excuse to do or to say whatever they want, and whose favorite verse, of course, is, judge not. They don't fear the Lord, and they choose pastors who will tell them that they don't have to fear the Lord. They tell them whatever they want to hear. The lawless want leaders who are declined, who enable their own decline, who tell them not to fear the Lord. Tell them there's no judgment for however you live, whatever you say. Doesn't matter. You can slander people right and left. God doesn't care, because they prayed a prayer some time back when they were children. They said the right words. They recited it correctly. Or they got baptized. And they were told, then grace will ensure that they are saved. They're saved from anything to have to fear from the Lord. There's nothing to have to fear from the Lord, they're told. No matter how they live, decline leaders preach a decline gospel that encourages more decline. Here, they were lawless. Their lawlessness is seen in there. The leaders, particularly, the leaders were lawless in their lack of integrity. They think they can make promises and not keep them, and there's no price to be paid. They think they can say whatever is useful. And then words become just a tool to get whatever you want. You don't have to worry about any repercussions for saying something that is not true, or you won't fulfill. And verse 4, they utter mere words. With empty oaths, they make covenants. Their commitments are worthless. They don't keep their word. It doesn't matter if they say, in the presence of God, angels, and this assembly, we most solemnly and joyfully enter into covenant with one another. They aren't going to keep it if they don't feel like it. Remember, they lack faithfulness, steadfast love, and knowledge of God. I think Americans have markedly declined in their integrity over just the past couple of generations, and the value they put on being faithful people of their word. We used to say in this culture things like, you're only as good as your word is your bond. We don't hear those sayings much anymore. You notice that? I don't think we hear them much anymore. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor almost 80 years ago, it'll be 80 years ago next year, one of the things that incensed many Americans, I think this is strange because I don't think this is the case anymore. At that time, one of the things that incensed many Americans is that the Japanese were going through the motions of negotiating for peace at the time. Franklin Roosevelt even mentioned it in his speech the next day, that they had been planning the attack. They had even launched their fleet while pretending they wanted peace. If you hear that speech again, listen for that. Because we don't hear that anymore. Think how odd that is. I mean, you've just gotten bombed. Almost 3,000 of your sailors and soldiers have been killed, and you're complaining that they didn't keep their word. Does that strike us as odd these days? We don't think that way anymore, I don't think. The Japanese admiral in charge, Yamamoto, who had been educated in the USA, knew, and he had advised the Japanese government, make sure you declare war first before we bomb, because he knew that the Americans would be offended, not just for being bombed first, but by the lack of integrity, by the empty words, like in verse 4 here. Now, I don't think that would happen today. I think if we got attacked by the Taliban while we were negotiating peace with them, we'd just say, it's to be expected. What do you think is going to happen? We don't expect people to keep their word anymore, because many of us don't keep our word anymore. The decline in marriage, the high divorce rate, isn't just because we're not focusing on the family enough, but because we don't think the marriage commitment means anything, because we don't think any commitments mean anything. The vows are just kind of empty words that we use to adorn a ceremony. We're not actually supposed to keep them, are we? Here the Lord scorns mere words, words that people don't mean, that they're not bound by, empty oaths, vows, or covenants that you don't keep. So instead of the luxuriant vines that they used to have, here, judgment will spring up like poisonous weeds in verse 4. The harvest of a culture of unfaithfulness, of a lack of integrity, is poisonous. Here, the leaders especially lack integrity. They don't keep their word. They promise first to be loyal to Assyria, and then they go try to ally with Egypt. And the result will be that Assyria will destroy them for that. The leaders in Samaria, the capital city, tremble because of their idol, which is an idol to the Lord, in Bethel, which means which he calls here in verse 5, Beth Aven. He calls Bethel, or Bethel, Beth Aven, Bethel, where their shrine to the Lord where their shrine to the Lord was. Bethel means house of God. Beth, house, El, of God. But here the Lord scorns it as Beth Aven, which means house of iniquity. It's not a house of God, like they said. It's a house of sin. The people, the priests of these images in the house of iniquity, they will mourn when it's all destroyed. Its glory, what gave it worth, importance, heaviness, the Lord himself has departed from them. The calf made to represent the Lord will be carried off as booty to Assyria to be a treasure for the great king of that empire. The place where it was in verse 8, the high places of Aven, of iniquity, they will be destroyed. And what used to be the place where everyone went for their festivals. Imagine Times Square, downtown New York, in Manhattan, a high traffic area. Instead, no one will go there anymore. So the weeds, the thorns will grow up because no one will bother to walk that way. So Israel will be ashamed of that idol, the thing that they've been so proud of for generations. Like people now people are always proud of their idols until it gets to be revealed that it's an idol. They're proud of their idols, how much money they have, how successful their business is. Maybe for the church business, how many members you have. Of other idols, the relationship they have. That their king, who was so lightweight that they denied they even had one worth paying attention to, will be carried away like a twig on a stream. And all of this will happen when the judgment they didn't fear was coming comes. Then they'll flee into the mountains to get away from the Assyrian troops and plead for the mountains to cover them, to collapse on them, and mercifully kill them, rather than fall into the hands of the Assyrians, who will unmercifully kill them. The Lord Jesus said that the people who made their choice about him on Good Friday will do the same, beg for the mountains to spare them, this time, his time, from Roman soldiers. And Revelation says that people will once again, who had before no fear of God, they will cry out to be crushed by the mountains rather than be judged by that God that before they had no fear of. Here in verse 9, God says that the Israelites have sinned from the days of Gibeah. They've not progressed from that time. And so just as Gibeah was destroyed for its sin, Israel will be destroyed. When I please, God says, I will discipline them in verse 10. He will discipline them with the instrument of other nations. Nations shall be gathered against them by the Lord. He gathers their enemies. Israel will be bound up, taken away from their double iniquity. In other words, twice the sin that deserved their destruction. Their leaders are led to destruction because they wouldn't tell them the truth. They wouldn't lead them to repentance. Today, speaking like this about poisonous weeds of judgment, from the previous chapter 8, about reaping the whirlwind, about discipline from God's hand being so severe that people would rather mountains collapse on them. Today, this is hardly ever heard. We've had a decline in leadership. Finally, there's been a decline of fruit. Before in verse 11, Israel was a trained calf. They just loved to do the work that it was supposed to do. Then the Lord didn't have to harness it with any rough yoke that would put calluses on his neck. Didn't have to. Just do what he was supposed to do. Now, after the decline, she must be yoked and burdened and pulled at, because the rebelliousness that is the fruit of her heart won't be easily controlled. They should, in verse 12, plant crops that produce the fruit of righteousness, that is, cultivate in themselves right lives, that produce justice. The fruit they would reap then would be steadfast love, right? Hesed. To get that, they need to break up that fallow ground. Fallow is hard, uncultivated ground. Overturn that hard, crusty surface of their heart that hasn't been cultivated, that's been left to nature, left to our fallen nature. They need to break up their hard heart and seek the Lord so that he'll come and rain righteousness on them. That's what they should have been doing. But instead, in verse 13, they've declined. They plowed instead of to cultivate righteousness, they plowed to plant iniquity, sin. The fruit then is a harvest of injustice. They oppress people, maybe because of their race, maybe they just need free labor on their plantations, or maybe they just think those people are inconvenient for my lifestyle right now, and so I'll abort them. The fruit they get then is from their lies, a culture of broken commitments, worthless vows, calling some people property or the mere product of conception. They got this because they trusted in their own way and what they thought was right for them. Trusted in their numbers and their money, maybe how many warriors or missiles or members they had. The result, the fruit of that in verse 14 will be, he says, turmoil, war, destruction particularly of the fortresses that they trusted in, the dashing of pieces of mothers with their children. The same will happen to you. Destruction will be the fruit of your harvest. Bethel, he addresses Bethel, house of God, because of the great evil of thinking that you could worship God any way you choose. It's for you, that you're the customer, that you're the king. Then, when that happens, the decline religion, they produce the decline hearts, and the decline leaders will produce the fruit of total destruction. Well, how about you? Have you been declining? Is your religion, your church attendance, your personal Bible reading and prayer about knowing and loving the Lord? Or about going through the motions? Like paying an insurance premium. You want him there to keep your lifestyle insured. In your heart, do you still have that first love that was like a plump, luscious grapes in the desert? Or is your heart now divided and distracted by other things? Have you shriveled up inside? Have you declined in integrity? You just gotten used to spouting empty words that you don't really mean. Is your heart hard? Has it gotten crusty and resistant so that things that used to appeal to you, appeals for you to love, to believe, to give, to worship, to serve, that those appeals that used to move you and to draw you, now they just glide off your back like water? Have you been declining? If so, right now, let the Word and the Spirit break up your fallow, untilled heart. Plant in your heart faith and harvest steadfast love. Don't be a religious person so sure of yourself, so hard-hearted by your self-righteousness that you would dare saunter up to the judgment seat boasting to Christ of how much you've done for him. That's the fruit of decline. Instead, say now, woe is me. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me.